Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to the channel. My name's Jared. Today I wanted to make a video continuing on from the other video I made a few weeks ago about limitations of the factory CA18DET engine, and I thought that I would do 5 different scenarios for different power levels for if you're looking to build or modify your engine. So those 5 setups I'm going to be looking at are 200 to 250, 250 to 300, 300 to 350, 350 to 400, and then 400 horsepower plus. Just to digress at the start here, these are my thoughts and opinions. This isn't the only way you can go about achieving these horsepower numbers, and everyone's going to have a different setup, or everyone's going to have different opinions, and every dyno you go on is going to read slightly different. So what you do on your car isn't always going to be exactly the same as someone else on their car. There's just too many variables that are going to affect the outcome in the end. But this is just sort of my idea or a ballpark on what you can do with your engine and your setup to get within this range of horsepower. So to start off with the 200 250 horsepower, this is what I would call sort of like the stock setup. So this is very minimal modifications for your car, and you probably don't even need a tune at this level for it to remain safe. So pretty much engine wise, you don't need to change your rods, your crankshaft, your pistons. You don't need studs, you don't need a head gasket, cams, valve spring. You don't need to port your cylinder head. You don't need to upgrade your valves. And probably the stock intercooler is alright for low 200s. Maybe if you want to get more toward that 250 mark, you might want to put some sort of upgraded intercooler on your car. In terms of the hot side, if you have a stock CA, then you've probably got like the first iteration of the T25 turbo. If you get a SR T25G, they flow slightly a bit better. And they're a little bit more reliable than the first gen. And you could also get a T28 from an S15, and that will bolt on all the lines. You can keep factory as well, there's no issues there. The manifold, just stick with the standard exhaust manifold, that's fine. The downpipe, you could probably leave the stock downpipe on, but you could upgrade that as well if you wanted to. And then for the exhaust size, I think with the factory exhaust, if you manage to find a car that still has one, I'd probably try and go and at least put a 2.5 inch exhaust on it. The wastegate, these 3 option turbos here, they're all internally gated. The cold side, there's no need to change the intake manifold or the butterflies or the throttle body in this scenario. For the electrical, the ECU, I reckon you could probably just leave it stock and just get a manual boost controller and run like those 3 turbos there. You can run sort of 12, 13, 14 PSI, and that would be the limit on them before you're going to cause any damage to the compressor wheel. Coil pack should be fine. Just change them if you've got reliability issues. The cam angle sensor should be fine at that point. You can stick with the MAF sensor you have. Don't need a crank angle sensor, and you could probably get away with 5 or 6 heat range plugs on that engine. Just stick with unleaded fuel. Your factory pump should be alright. Maybe if it's still the original 30-year-old fuel pump, go put a Walbro 255 in it, just so you're not risking leaning out. And you could probably just leave the standard injectors, and all of the fuel system should be fine, and the gearbox and clutch should be able to handle that fine. It's just pretty much your stock setup with maybe changing the turbo and just turning the boost up. That's pretty much all this is. Next, moving on to the 250 300 horsepower setup. So this is what I would call like reliable range. So again, you don't need to touch anything internally on the engine. The only thing I would change is probably just the intercooler. I think you should upgrade at this point. You're leaving a lot of performance on the table by not upgrading it. For the turbo, probably the T28 ball bearing or maybe bush is going to leave you a little bit more towards that 250 range. And maybe if you wanted to upgrade to something newer, probably a 2860 Gen 2 is going to be fine. Manifold standard, you probably want to upgrade your downpipe at this point. Split pulse or bell mouth, either way it's fine. And you want to go probably 3-inch exhaust at this point, turbo back, and you can stick with the internal gate. One thing you could do with the ball bearing turbo is try and port out that internal gate. It might get you a bit more flow. Again, don't touch the cold side. The manifold's all good at this level. The ECU, for these sort of mild upgrades, the NIS tune is pretty good for this. And if you wanted to, you could use any ECU you wanted. For coil packs, the standard ones might be fine, but if they're 30-year-old, maybe look at getting the Splitfire coil packs. You can stick with the factory cam angle sensor, don't need a crank angle sensor yet. The MAF, the standard MAF, is not going to be able to handle the flow at this power level. So a lot of people like to go for the Z32 MAF, but they're sort of getting a bit old as well. So the R35 GTR MAF, or if you had a different ECU that has a map sensor, I would go with that. And spark plugs, probably need to go for a 6 heat range here and gap it down somewhere between 20 and 30 thou. I'd stick with 98 or unleaded fuel at this point, and you're gonna want to upgrade your pump. The Walbro 255 is going to be fine for this level. Your injectors, you're going to need bigger injectors, so you could probably try and get some from a GTR. They're going to be fine, or 550cc aftermarket injectors, whatever brand they are, that's going to be fine at this level and still have a little bit of headroom as well. And just leave the rest of the fuel system standard, that's alright. The gearbox is still fine at this level. The clutch, depending on your tune, it may start to slip, so you might want to look at getting just a slightly upgraded clutch setup. You can still use an organic disc and maybe a slightly heavier pressure plate, but it's still going to be very nice and drivable at this level. So then moving on to the 300 to 350 horsepower. So I really feel like at this horsepower range, this is probably the most cost effective in terms of setup. And I think this is going to be the most fun on the street. When you're getting more past 350 horsepower, it's starting to become a little bit unusable and a bit dangerous, to be honest, driving on the street. So in terms of the rods, so you can keep the factory rods. Just when you tune it, you want to tell your tuner that it is still factory rods, and to try and keep the torque limit under 450 newtons. The crankshaft's still fine here. The pistons, so you can keep the standard pistons at this point too, but you're already pushing the engine here, so you really want to try and avoid any sort of detonation that might be caused by like two-step or launch control, anti-lag, something like that. The main studs are fine here. The head studs, with those factory rods and pistons, if you are going 18-20 psi, it's really at the limit there, and maybe you want to think about putting some ARP head studs in and like a multi-layer steel gasket. You might still be able to get away with the factory studs and gasket at that level. The cams are still fine here, but as you approach 350 horsepower, your torque's going to start to taper off, which isn't going to necessarily be bad because you're still running the factory rods and pistons. But just expect that even with a bigger turbo, it is going to start to roll over, and don't expect to be able to rev the engine up to 8,500–9,000 RPM with those factory springs. So I would say 7,000–7,500 is a good range for the factory valve springs for you to rev your engine. Don't need to port the cylinder head, don't need to upgrade your valves, but the intercooler, again, you probably want to step it up at this point and try and get something that's probably as big as you can fit in the front of your car there inside the bumper. And the piping size, you might want to look at getting away from the factory, using some of the factory piping that came with the side mount, and go to something that's at least 2–2¼ inches in size. For the turbo, we're gonna need to step away from factory options here and go something like a 2867 or 2871 or 2876 Garrett. The hypergear, so like the hypergear turbo I got, the ART28SS if you're in Australia, that is good for this sort of range as well. I would recommend probably go the external option, or a TDO625G. I know that's pretty popular for the SR guys, but you could also use it on the CA. It is going to be slightly a bit laggier than the other options there. The manifold, you can still stick with the standard exhaust manifold at this point. You are losing a little bit of performance by sticking with it, but it should still get you to that range that you want. Definitely need a downpipe, whatever you want to choose, split pulse or bell mouth, or external if you're changing your turbo. Exhaust size, you need at least 3 inches here, and yeah, like I said, the wastegate can be internal, but I would probably lean towards going external at this point. Cold side, that's all still fine, don't need to touch anything there. The ECU, the news tune may still be fine here if you've got like an R35 GTR MAF, but I would recommend getting something better and something more reliable. Coil packs, I think the standard coil packs, they're probably going to be failing by now, so I think the split fire is going to be fine at this power level. Cam angle sensor, you can still use that with the ECU. Your tuner might need to put a bit of a filter on the signal from it because it might be a little bit noisy, but it should still work. And like the MAF, I said I would probably lean towards getting an aftermarket ECU with a map sensor at this point, and you could use 6 heat range plugs or maybe 7 if you're having a problem with tuner. Fuel, so this is probably sort of the limit of unleaded here, and if you want to make it a little bit more reliable, you could go towards E85. The Walbro 255 with E85 is going to be at capacity, so you might want to go for the Walbro 460. The injector size, so you're probably going to need at least 550s here, and 750 is going to be a little bit safer in there. And the regulator, the line size, and the fuel rail is all going to be good here. The gearbox, this is sort of the limit of the factory gearbox before you're going to start looking at breaking it. And your organic disc clutch is probably not going to hold this level of horsepower, so I would go to like a ceramic clutch with like 4, 5, 6 pucks on it, and upgraded pressure plate. So now we got the 350 to 400, so this is you're getting pretty serious here, and this is where we're going to need to start changing a lot more parts. So the rods, you're going to need to go forged rods. Standard crankshaft still fine. You want to upgrade your pistons. At this point you can think about whether you want to go up with a bit of compression to like 9 to 1 or 9.5 to 1. You're going to probably need to upgrade your main studs and head studs with ARP options, and you're definitely going to need a multi-layer steel head gasket. Cams, you're going to need to upgrade your cams here. I would sort of lean more towards the 264 degree, because you might put the 256s in, they'll do the job, but maybe in the future if you upgrade again, you probably want the 264s. And if they're not like Tomei drop-in cams, then I would get some cam gears as well to help dial them in, because it's going to help you get to your horsepower. Valve springs, you're definitely going to need some sort of valve springs here. Maybe not some serious valve springs, but like some sort of performance valve springs, so you can get another 1000 RPM, because your cams are going to then shift that whole power band up a bit more, so you want to make sure you can use that. Cylinder head porting, if you're doing your valve springs and you've got your cylinder head off and you're doing the head gasket as well, I would try and clean up that port as much as possible. This is sort of like the limitation at this point, trying to flow as much air as possible through the head. Still the standard valves are fine, but I would just try and clean the intake and exhaust ports out. Intercooler, just fit pretty much the biggest thing you can in your front bumper, and go at least 2.25 to 2.75 inch in piping size. For the turbos, you're going to need to step up again in the Garrett range, something like a 3071 Gen 2. The TDO625G might still be able to perform at this level, but you will need an external gate, or a G25 550. That would probably be my recommendation, or go to at that power level, and you should still have a little bit of headroom on that as well. For the manifold, the stock manifold, you might still be able to use it, but I would try to go towards the tubular, especially you're going to need an external wastegate at this point, and the tubular manifolds usually come with provision to put a external wastegate on. So the downpipe, just make it as big as the turbo outlet, and the exhaust size go at least 3 inches, but I would try and go 3.5 if you're making something up. If you've already got the 3, maybe try the 3 inch first. If you're getting something made completely new, I'd go straight to 3.5 inch. For the wastegate, go at least 40 mil, and I think 45 mil is a safer option here. Make sure if you're getting your manifold that the pipe on the wastegate is 45 mil if you want to run a 45 mil gate. Cold side, everything's still fine here. We're approaching the limit of the cold side now. For electrical, ECU, definitely get something aftermarket here. Haltech, Link, AM, Motec, whatever it is you want to get. Coil packs, the split fires, it's going to be the limit probably of a split fire, and you might want to look at going smart coils like the R35 GTR. Cam angle sensor, you're gonna need to upgrade this unless you're going to go the crank angle sensor, and then you could probably just use the stock cam angle sensor as like a good reference point for the ECU. And then the MAF, don't run a MAF at this level, just go with a MAP sensor and with the aftermarket ECU. And your spark plugs, they're going to need to be a 7 heat range. Maybe your tuner will want you to run some specific platinum plugs as well, so just ask him or her, whoever's tuning a car. Fuel, definitely recommend going E85 or E90 at this point. It's going to be the safest option and help you make the power easy. You're going to need a Walbro 460 or 520. The injectors, probably 1000 to 1500 cc's. Fuel pressure regulator, with these fuel pumps, it's a bit too much fuel and pressure for the stock regulator, so you'll need to go aftermarket regulator at this level. The factory fuel lines, this is the limit. Maybe you might not make 400 with the factory fuel lines, but if you can do it, go -6 from the pump all the way to the fuel rail. Nitrous, don't really need nitrous at this level. Maybe if you want to bring on the turbo a little bit earlier or make a bit more top end, you could use it, but I don't think you'll need it. The fuel rail, it's probably still fine at this level, but if you're changing all the AN lines and fuel pressure regulator, then I would probably go and just change it to the same point and make it all the same. The gearbox, you're pretty much past the safe point with your gearbox. Maybe if you've got a really good one, it might last a while. But the Z32 gearbox, RB25, they might be a good aftermarket factory upgrade. The clutch, you're pretty much going to want the strongest single disc clutch that they sell at this point, and I think most of them will probably be limited to about 600 Newton meters at single disc. For the last option, I'm not going to do like 450, 500, 550 option. I'm just going to say this is 400 horsepower and up, because this is really sort of like the limit of the CA engine and it being even aftermarket. So this is going to be the expensive option. So again, rods, forged, crankshaft. If their factory crankshaft's good for about 600 horsepower, but if you're getting to that range, you're probably going to consider going for a stroker option to a 2 litre or 2.1, something like that. Pistons, again, forged. You can look at whatever compression ratio you want at this point. ARP, main studs and head studs. Multi-layer steel head gasket. Cams, I'd probably try and get sort of the biggest you can. Go at least 270 degree with some cam gears. Valve springs, whatever your flavor is with that option. Cylinder head porting. Try and port the cylinder head as much as possible. This is a big limitation on the CA engine, to try and make big horsepower compared to the SR. The SR, the cylinder head ports flow a lot better. The valves, if you can, maybe if you want to make like over 450 horsepower, you might want to try and fit a larger valve in there as well to get a bit more flow. The bore, you can look at overboring and getting bigger pistons, like 0.5 mil or 1 mil over. I'd try not to go more than 0.5 mil. If you want to go more than 0.5 mil, I'd get the block tested for the wall thickness and maybe offset the bore just so you don't make the bore too thin and weak in a point. Intercooler, you want to make it as big as possible again at the front, and the piping size you probably want 2.5 to 3 inches. For the turbo, I'd go like 3076, maybe 3085, or maybe a G3660 or G3700, something like that. The manifold, again tubular. Make sure the wastegate you want to run matches the wastegate on the manifold. The downpipe, 3.5 inches. Exhaust size, at least 3.5. You could go 3.25, 4 inches. Just make sure it fits under your car. The wastegate, 45 to 50 mil, I think would be fine. The cold side, so the intake manifold, I would try and upgrade it at this point. It might still work at the more towards the 400 range. The butterfly valves, they are starting to become a restriction, so you could look at removing it and welding up the holes. And throttle body, you might want to go something like 70, 75, 80 mil, or drive by wire, something like that. Just make sure you don't go like 85, 90, 95 mil. It's not a big engine, it's going to make the car really undrivable at low RPM. The ECU, any aftermarket ECU, whatever you want to choose. R35 GTR smart coils. Upgrade the cam angle sensor, your crank angle sensor. These are going to make the engine really safe when you're pushing the engine this hard. Go for a map sensor. Just ask it, what spark plug to use. Fuel, E85, E90, race gas, whatever you want to use in this case. Gonna need like a 460 or 520. If you're getting up like over 500 horsepower, you might want to look at doing a surge tank as well. Injectors, 1500 horsepower at the lower end of that 400 horsepower range, and 2500s if you want to go pretty much as high as possible. You're going to need to upgrade your fuel pressure regulator, your fuel line size probably to -8 when you're getting to like 500 horsepower. Your fuel rail, just upgrade that like I said before with your fuel lines and all that, so it all matches. Your gearbox, you could probably still use the Z32 RB boxes or CD009, or maybe if you wanted you could put like dog gears or sequentially in those boxes. The clutch, you're going to need at least a twin disc or maybe even a triple disc clutch at this level. Alright guys, so hopefully you enjoyed this video. Again, I just wanted to stress these are my thoughts and opinions and beliefs with the setups for the CA engines. You can use this information and do with it as you wish, but just remember whatever mods you have and whatever dyno you go, the horsepower you make is going to be slightly different to someone else. If you're not sure, please ask a professional or your tuner what they think as well, because they're going to have a preference on parts and brands and ECUs and that type of thing that they feel comfortable with. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.